I used to think being overlooked in my family was just a quiet kind of pain I had to learn to live with. I never imagined the truth would explode in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner, while everyone was still raising their glasses to celebrate my sister. And the FBI walked through the front door with handcuffs and a secret strong enough to burn everything down. My name is Bridget Whitney. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a senior forensic accountant at a Fortune 500 firm. 3 years ago, my parents did something I still can't think about without feeling my chest tighten. They took their entire $500, 000 retirement fund, every dollar they had saved for their future, and handed it to my sister Meredith so she could launch her startup. What hurt me wasn't just the money. It was the way they did it. They called me to the dinner table, not to ask for my opinion as someone who worked in finance. And definitely not because they respected my expertise. They brought me there to sit quietly, take notes, and watch Meredith shine. I remember looking at her projections, the inflated revenue estimates, the missing operational structure, the gaps in the plan, and knowing almost immediately that something was wrong. I pointed out the red flags, one by one, and my mother cut me off before I could even finish. She told me not to be jealous. I said I just didn't understand business. In that moment, I realized the truth meant nothing when it came from me. 3 years later, during Thanksgiving dinner, in front of 30 guests, FBI agents walked through my parents' front door and put Meredith in handcuffs. And the very first thing she screamed was, "This was Dad's idea." But to explain how we got there, I have to start with an older truth. In my family, some daughters were born to shine, and some were born to clap for the ones who did. As a child, I learned early that there were two kinds of daughters in my house. Meredith was the kind who could walk into a room and make the whole room revolve around her. She was beautiful, magnetic, loud in all the ways people seem to love. She knew how to make relatives laugh, how to command attention, how to turn every family gathering into her stage. I was the opposite. I was the girl who sat quietly in corners with a book, the one who finished her homework early, the one who could go hours without anyone noticing whether I had spoken at all. Back then, I didn't think of it as unfair. I thought maybe that was just how families worked. Some people were stars, and some people were the audience. Meredith could hum a song in the living room, and everyone would applaud like she had just finished a concert. I could bring home straight A's, and the first question would still be about Meredith's latest audition. No one ever said out loud that she mattered more than I did. But they didn't have to. It was there in the way they looked at her, in the way they remembered every detail about her life, and forgot the simplest things about mine. I grew up in a home where the spotlight always found the same person, and the other person was expected to get used to the dark. At the time, I didn't have the language for what that did to me. I just kept trying harder, hoping that if I was good enough, smart enough, useful enough, maybe one day they would finally turn around and see me too. The first time I truly understood my place in the family was at my high school graduation. I was valedictorian, and I had worked for that honor for 4 straight years. I stayed up late studying, turned down parties, pushed myself until my eyes burned from exhaustion. When they called my name and I stepped up to give my speech, I looked out at the crowd and searched for my parents' faces. Their seats were empty. I still gave the speech. I still smiled. I still did exactly what I had worked so hard to do. But inside, something dropped. My parents arrived 20 minutes late and slipped into the back row just as I was stepping down from the podium. Afterward, my mother adjusted my graduation cap and explained that Meredith had a callback for a commercial and they couldn't just leave her there alone. Meredith was 21 years old. She had a driver's license. She had a phone. She was fully capable of sitting in a waiting room by herself. But then my mother looked at me and softened her voice. You understand. Right, you're independent. You don't need us cheering for you the way Meredith does. I nodded. I even smiled. At the time, I thought being called independent was a compliment. It took me 15 years to realize independent was just the word my parents used for the daughter they could neglect without feeling guilty. They weren't late because I was strong. They were late because I was the child they trusted to swallow her disappointment quietly. I brought my valedictorian medal home that night, put it in a drawer, and no one in my family ever asked to see it. 12 years later, I had built a life I was genuinely proud of. I became a senior forensic accountant at Morrison & Hartley, one of the most respected financial firms in Chicago. I earned a six-figure salary. I worked on major fraud investigations. I had helped with cases tied to the SEC and assisted on financial analysis that contributed to federal convictions. At work, I was respected. My bosses trusted me with complex audits. My colleagues treated me like someone whose judgment mattered. None of that meant anything at my parents' dinner table. I still remember one Sunday dinner when my father casually asked if I was still doing that numbers thing. I explained, again, that I was a forensic accountant, that I analyzed financial statements, traced fraud, and worked with federal investigators. He waved his fork dismissively, as if I had just described filing paperwork. Meredith laughed from across the table. At the time, she was consulting, which was her polished way of describing unemployment. But the way my parents looked at her, you would have thought she was one breakthrough away from changing the world. My mother refilled Meredith's wine and said she had vision, that she could see the big picture. My father added that I was good with details and behind-the-scenes work, which was useful too because somebody had to do it. I sat there holding my fork and feeling like I was listening to them describe two strangers. I had just testified in a federal fraud case, and the defendant was facing 15 years in prison. But in my family, I was still the daughter who worked for someone else, while Meredith was the one born to create something extraordinary. Then came the Tuesday night call that changed everything. My mother told me there would be a family meeting the next evening, and that Meredith had something important to announce. She even told me to dress nicely. When I walked into the dining room, Meredith had turned it into a mini stage. There was a projector, a laptop, and a sleek silver company logo on the screen, Novate Tech Solutions. My parents were already seated, glowing with excitement in a way I had never seen them glow for anything I had ever accomplished. Meredith launched into a startup pitch full of buzzwords: AI, data management, market disruption, scalable growth. It sounded polished on the surface, but the longer I listened, the worse it got. She projected $2 million in first-year revenue with no existing client base, no finished product, no technical co-founder, and no real development team in place. Then, with a rehearsed tremble in her voice, she announced that Mom and Dad had agreed to be her first major investors. My mother squeezed my father's hand and said they were putting in $500,000, their entire retirement savings. I felt the room tilt. I forced myself to stay calm and asked what her projections were based on, what the client acquisition model looked like, what the burn rate was, and who exactly these angel investors were. I didn't even finish before my mother snapped at me for ruining the moment. My father stood up and said this was Meredith's night, not the time for interrogation. But I wasn't interrogating anyone. I was doing what any sane investor would do. I looked at my parents, looked at Meredith's smile, and understood that they did not want the truth. They wanted the fantasy. If you can already see how wrong this was, comment 1 and stay with me. I stood up, looked at all three of them, and quietly said, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning and wrote the longest email I had ever sent my parents. I knew there was a good chance they wouldn't read it. But I had to try. I laid out every problem in Meredith's pitch. The unrealistic revenue projections. The lack of a client base. The missing operating budget. The absence of a named technical team. The vague references to angel investors with no identities attached. I linked articles about startup failure rates. I built a spreadsheet myself showing what responsible early-stage funding would actually look like. And at the end, I begged them for one simple thing: give me 2 weeks. Let me pay for an independent audit. Let me verify her claims before they moved every dollar they had saved into her company. I wasn't asking them to trust me blindly. I was asking them to do the bare minimum before making a life-changing decision. 2 weeks passed in total silence. When I finally called my mother, she said my email had been very long. Then she told me, in an almost casual voice, that the money had already been transferred the day before because Meredith needed it for a time-sensitive opportunity. My hand tightened around the phone so hard it hurt. I knew exactly what this was. And it wasn't business. It was a disaster in slow motion. And I was standing there watching it unfold. I begged my mother to at least keep records. To get everything in writing. To document anything suspicious. She cut me off and hung up. After that call, I opened my laptop, created a folder labeled Novate, and saved the email inside it. Not because I wanted the satisfaction of saying I told you so someday, but because I needed proof for myself that I had tried. I needed something that would remind me I wasn't crazy for seeing what was so painfully obvious. A year later, there was a moment when I almost wondered if I had been too harsh. At my mother's birthday party, Meredith pulled up in a gleaming white BMW wearing designer sunglasses and the kind of expression people wear when they want to be admired before they even speak. She casually announced that it was a company car, then corrected herself and admitted it was technically leased but covered by Novate. Relatives rushed over to congratulate her like she had just gone public on the stock market. My father puffed up with pride and said he had always known she had that spark. My mother looked at Meredith like she was proof that every choice they had made was right. I stood by the punch bowl and watched the entire performance with the eyes of someone who had seen too many companies use image to hide rot. The car wasn't owned. The assistant Meredith had brought was just a freelancer hired for the day. The polished office shots on social media were taken in a co-working space, rented by the hour. But my family didn't care. As long as the lighting was flattering and the surface looked convincing, no one wanted to ask what was underneath. My Aunt Margaret cornered me near the appetizers and asked if I was still doing taxes. When I corrected her and said forensic accounting, she smiled vaguely and suggested I ask Meredith for career advice. Later, I overheard my mother in the kitchen saying Meredith needed another $50,000 to cover a temporary cash flow gap, and that this was totally normal for startups. My father sounded less certain that time, but he still said nothing. I left early and claimed I had a headache. In the car, I reopened my Novate folder and added a note, additional $50. 000 from parents. No supporting documentation. I still didn't know which domino would fall first. I only knew the line had already begun to tip. After that party, Meredith found me outside in the backyard where I had gone to escape the noise. String lights hung behind her, making the whole scene look almost cinematic, as if even our private confrontation had to be framed beautifully for her. She asked me why I always looked like someone had died. I looked at the champagne glass in her hand and asked, lightly, about the car lease and the company's burn rate. Just one question. And I saw her smile flicker. She demanded to know why I was doing this. Whether I was trying to sabotage her. I told her I just wanted to know where the money was actually going. In that moment, I saw something I had only suspected before. Under the makeup, under the confidence, under the performance, Meredith was afraid. Not the fear of someone dealing with temporary stress, The fear of someone who knows that what she has built can't survive honest scrutiny. But almost immediately, she recovered and slipped back into the familiar arrogance I had known all my life. She accused me of being jealous since childhood because she was prettier, more talented, more loved. I looked at her and felt something sadder than anger. I wasn't jealous. I was horrified that someone could burn through her parents' life savings inside a fantasy and still think she was the victim when anyone dared ask questions. Meredith stepped closer, jabbed a finger at my chest, and warned me that I had no idea what she was capable of. I told her that was exactly what worried me. We stood there, two sisters who had never really been friends, separated by only a few feet and an entire lifetime of emotional distance. When she turned and walked away, I noticed her hand trembling slightly around the glass. Truly confident people don't tremble like that. Guilty people do. That night, driving home, I had to pull over because my mind was in knots. I sat there in the dark with the engine idling and asked myself what I could possibly do now. I had warned them. I had sent the email. I had asked the obvious questions. I had allowed myself to be cast as the jealous sister just for speaking plainly. If I kept pushing, I would only become more firmly trapped in the role my family had already written for me. I thought about my grandfather Harold, the only person in my family who had ever truly seen me. He used to say that some lessons cannot be taught. They have to be lived. My job wasn't to save people from themselves. My job was to make sure I wasn't standing in the blast zone when reality finally arrived. His words came back to me that night with painful clarity. I picked up the phone and called my father. I told him plainly that if Meredith needed more money, he should not ask me, because I would not participate. He told me I had never had any family spirit. I told him family spirit was not blind loyalty. It was honesty, even when honesty made people uncomfortable. He hung up. I sat there for a long time after that, letting myself feel the full weight of what I was doing. I wasn't abandoning my family. I was refusing to drown with them. Sometimes that is the bravest thing a person can do. That decision didn't make me feel better right away. It didn't stop the grief. But it gave me something I had never really had before, a boundary. From that night on, I knew I would no longer try to rescue them from the consequences of their own blindness. The silence came slowly. But once it settled in, it was total. First, I stopped being invited to Sunday dinners. My father would text that Mom was tired or that they were keeping it small. And then a few hours later, Meredith's social media would show the whole family gathered around the table without me. Then I was removed from the group texts. After that came the beach trips, the restaurant dinners, the resort weekends, all of them featuring my parents and Meredith. And never me. 3 months later, the first message I got from my mother wasn't asking how I was or saying they missed me. It was a Venmo request for an appliance she had bought. I paid it without comment. The worst part wasn't being left out. It was being erased. I saw a photo my mother posted with the caption, "My beautiful family." And there they were, smiling with Meredith in the center, while my absence went completely unmentioned. I wasn't just forgotten. I was edited out. I started to understand what it means to mourn a family that is still alive, but has already decided to behave as if you don't exist. I stopped checking their social media. I stopped waiting for calls that never came. I poured myself into my work, my apartment, and the few friends in my life who actually knew how to show up. But late at night, there were still moments when I wondered how people could make someone feel invisible while still claiming to love them. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, hit the like button. Sometimes even a small gesture can remind someone they're not alone. I kept going, kept working, kept pretending I was fine, even as that silence pulled everything in my family closer to collapse. 2 years after my parents made that investment, I got a phone call from an elderly man who introduced himself as Theodore Marsh. the attorney who had handled my grandfather's estate. I almost dropped my coffee when I heard Harold's name. It had been 4 years since my grandfather died. Mr. Marsh explained that my grandfather had left specific instructions for him to deliver certain supplemental documents to me personally when, in his words, "The time is right." I asked him how he could possibly know when that time had come. He was quiet for a moment, then said with blunt honesty that when things started falling apart for my parents, I would need to know I wasn't crazy. And I would need something solid to stand on. The second he said that, my throat tightened, even from beyond the grave. My grandfather understood me better than anyone else in that family ever had. For years, I had been made to question myself, my instincts, my professionalism, my motives. I had been called jealous, negative, difficult, unsupportive. And yet my grandfather had apparently seen the fracture clearly, long before the house finally split. Mr. Marsh said Harold had once told him I was the only person in my family who could tell the difference between what was real and what was merely shine. After that call, I sat at my table staring at a mug of coffee gone cold and cried. Not because I was sad, but because I was relieved. Being seen by someone, believed by someone, even someone no longer alive, can heal more than most people realize. I still didn't know what my grandfather had left behind for me. But just knowing that he had planned for a moment like this made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. I no longer felt entirely alone. About a month later, at a financial crimes conference downtown, I ran into someone I had worked with once before on a previous case, FBI Special Agent Carla Reyes. She recognized me first and greeted me with the sharp, focused warmth of someone who remembers the people who actually do their jobs well. Carla brought up the Thornton security case and said my analysis of the shell company transfers had been so precise it practically handed them their conviction. I laughed and told her I had just followed the numbers. She looked at me closely and said that was exactly why I was good at what I did. Most people follow stories. I followed structure. Before leaving, she pulled a business card from her pocket and handed it to me. Her name? The White Collar Crime Unit. The FBI seal. She told me that if I ever saw anything unusual in my work, anything that kept me up at night, I should call her. That sentence hit me harder than it should have. For 1 second, I almost said it all. I almost told her my sister was running something that felt deeply wrong, and that my parents had sunk everything into it while refusing to listen to me. But I didn't. I didn't have hard evidence. I didn't have transaction records or documents proving a crime. I had professional instincts, years of experience, and a dread I couldn't explain in a way my family would ever accept. So I told her it was just work stress. Carla didn't push. She only said that some kinds of stress eventually come with a name and a dollar amount. I slipped the card into my wallet behind my license and told myself I would never need it. Looking back now, that feels almost funny. Sometimes we keep things close because some part of us already knows the future before we're ready to admit it. 3 years after my parents wrote that check, my mother called one Tuesday afternoon and told me we were having a big Thanksgiving gathering that year. 30 guests, family and friends. And Meredith had a special announcement to make. My mother's voice was bright in a way that felt too polished, as though she were forcing cheerfulness over something unstable underneath. By then I had barely been part of the family for a long time. So the invitation made me feel 2 things at once, suspicious and strangely hopeful. Some small part of me was still the girl who thought, maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I picked out a navy dress. Simple and professional. The kind of dress that made me feel composed and grounded. I arrived 15 minutes early. And that was my first mistake. The second I stepped in, my mother shoved a turkey apron into my hands and told me to help set out appetizers, organize the drink station, and answer the door because Meredith was upstairs resting to save her energy for the presentation. I stood there, holding that ridiculous apron, and couldn't even summon surprise. I had not been invited as an honored member of the family. I had been summoned as support staff for Meredith's latest coronation. For the next hour, I arranged cheese trays, filled ice buckets, greeted guests, and smiled politely, like hired help in my own parents' house. Then, when the room was packed, Meredith made her entrance. She came down the staircase in a red dress, full makeup, expensive heels, looking like she had stepped out of a carefully staged success fantasy. Everyone turned. Everyone watched. My mother nearly teared up, and there I was, still standing by the lemonade in my navy dress and that stupid turkey apron, promising myself silently that whatever happened that night, it would be the last time I stood in that house and allowed myself to feel small. Right before dinner, my father stood up and called for everyone's attention. He raised a glass and started talking about family, success, and the importance of dreaming big. Then he turned the whole speech into a tribute to Meredith, calling her the pride of the Whitney family. He praised the $500,000 investment as though it were the smartest decision of his life and declared that Novate was paying off beyond anything they had imagined. I stood frozen by the sideboard, still holding the gravy boat. Then, as if he didn't want to leave me out entirely, he turned to his other daughter. But it wasn't recognition. It was humiliation. He said he hoped someday I would learn from Meredith, stop working for other people, and build something of my own. Then he joked that every family needs a worker bee while the rest of them think big. The room laughed. I still remember that sound. It wasn't loud enough to be dramatic, but it was unified enough to leave a scar. My mother added, in that sweet false voice of hers, that being an employee was still respectable because not everyone was born to lead. Aunt Margaret covered her smile. Uncle Thomas laughed openly. I counted about 30 faces in that room. 30 people listening to my parents frame me as the failed version of my sister. And, strangely, I didn't cry. I had gone beyond tears by then. Instead, I memorized every face, every smirk, every pair of eyes that chose comfort over truth. There was a strange feeling rising inside me in that moment. Like something in my bones already knew the story was not ending there. Something was coming. Something real. And in just a few minutes, every person in that room would be forced to look at the family they admired through an entirely different lens. If you've ever watched fake perfection collapse in real time, hit like on this video. Some truths arrive late. But once they do, nothing can stop them. The doorbell rang just as the room was sitting at the peak of its smug happiness. My mother frowned because she thought everyone had already arrived. She went to open the door while I stayed where I was near the wall, still holding a serving spoon like a member of the catering staff at my own family's dinner. When the door opened, I saw two people in dark suits standing on the porch. The woman in front held up a badge and introduced herself as Special Agent Carla Reyes with the FBI. In a single second, the entire house went silent. 30 people turned toward the foyer at once. Like one body. My mother stammered that there had to be some mistake. But Carla stepped inside, scanned the room, and fixed her eyes on Meredith, who was still standing there with a champagne glass in hand. Her voice was calm, sharp, and clean as a blade. They were there to arrest Meredith Whitney for securities fraud and wire fraud related to Novate Tech Solutions. I watched the color drain from Meredith's face almost instantly. My father tried to step in with that familiar puffed-up authority he used whenever he thought being a patriarch would make reality bend. It didn't. The other agent moved in with handcuffs. And then the room exploded. Gasps. Shouts. A dropped glass. Chairs scraping. Through all of it, Carla read Meredith her rights while I stood perfectly still. I had not called the FBI. I had not turned my sister in, but when Carla glanced at me and gave the smallest nod, I understood it for what it was, one professional acknowledging another. In the middle of all that chaos, I felt no triumph, only a terrible stillness. Meredith began screaming and thrashing, transformed in seconds from the glamorous woman in the red dress into someone cornered and unraveling. That was the moment the performance ended. And then came the worst part of all. As Agent Morrison secured the cuffs around Meredith's wrists, she screamed something that froze the entire room. "This was Dad's idea." I saw my father's face go gray in an instant. Meredith was sobbing now, mascara running down her cheeks, shouting that Dad had told her fake investor reports would help them pull in more money, that he had helped her draft the false financials, that he said it was just creative accounting and everyone did it. My mother swayed as if she had been hit. She turned to my father and asked whether he had known. He tried to explain, stammering. But Meredith kept going, accusing him of promising to protect her. Just minutes earlier, he had been standing in that same room, raising a toast to her success. Now that same room was watching the dream he had worshipped tear our family apart from the inside. My mother collapsed. Guests panicked. Someone yelled for water. Someone else called 911. And I stood there feeling a strange emptiness in my chest. I thought I would feel vindicated. I thought maybe some part of me would be satisfied. But I wasn't. This was not a victory. It was watching a house burn after you had spent years warning everyone that you smelled smoke in the walls. The paramedics later confirmed that my mother had only fainted from shock. But those few minutes were enough to rip every illusion to shreds in front of 30 witnesses. I didn't need to say a word. I didn't need to defend my instincts or my expertise or my motives. The truth had walked through the front door all by itself and read out the charges in my parents' living room. After the guests began scattering, Carla pulled me aside near the front door to make one thing very clear: I had not caused any of this. The investigation had come from outside investors who hired independent auditors after noticing inconsistencies in Novate's quarterly reports. Carla told me Meredith had siphoned nearly $2.3 million from multiple investors. My parents' $500,000 was just the beginning. Hearing that number made my stomach turn. I had known Meredith was lying. I had known the company was rotten. But knowing and hearing the real scale of the fraud were two different things. Carla also told me they would be looking into my father's role, though she couldn't confirm the outcome on the spot. Before leaving, she handed me a victim services card because there was a strong chance my parents would lose everything once the civil lawsuits hit. What caught me off guard most was when Carla mentioned my grandfather Harold. During background research, his name had come up as someone with a reputation for honesty, and she said he would have been proud of me. That simple sentence hit me harder than I expected. In the middle of the chaos, the crying, the shame, and the sound of my mother sobbing in the next room, it felt like a hand on my shoulder, a reminder that seeing clearly does not make you cruel. After Carla left, I remained standing there in the foyer, still wearing that ridiculous turkey apron, holding a victim services card while the remains of my family collapsed around me. That was when I understood something important. The truth is not neat. It does not arrive as a graceful moment of justice. It arrives like a storm, and when it passes, it leaves wreckage behind. Once the house had emptied out and only family remained, my father found me in the kitchen where I was taking off that apron. His voice was rough and desperate. He said I was good with finances, that I understood paperwork, that I could help. What he meant was that I could tell the authorities he didn't know what Meredith was doing, that he was just a trusting retiree, deceived by his daughter. I turned and looked at him carefully. This was the same man who had mocked me in front of 30 people only hours earlier, who had called me a worker bee, who had laughed while everyone else joined in. And now he wanted me to save him with my professional credibility and a lie. I reminded him that 3 years earlier I had sent him an email laying out everything wrong with Novate's finances. He had read it. He went pale. I told him I wasn't going to volunteer to testify against him. But I also wasn't going to lie for him. "This is your family," he said. I answered that he was the one who had taught me Whitney's Tell the Truth. When I was 8 years old and lied about breaking a vase. He grounded me for a month because honesty, according to him, was not negotiable. I was only living by the lesson he gave me. He had no answer for that. I walked past the living room where my mother sat wrapped in a blanket and crying. And I went out the front door without looking back. But as I reached my car, Aunt Margaret came after me. She apologized for laughing, for telling me over the years that I should learn from Meredith. I listened, and I could see the remorse on her face. But I could also see something else. Her awakening had only come once the FBI arrived. I told her so. I didn't need to punish her. I just couldn't pretend that a late apology could erase years of choosing not to see what was right in front of her. I got in my car and drove away feeling, for the first time in my life, that I had stopped asking permission to respect myself. 3 days after Thanksgiving, Theodore Marsh called again and told me the time had come. His office looked exactly how I imagined the office of a 70-year-old estate attorney would look: dark wood, leather chairs, walls lined with books. He opened a thick file and explained that my grandfather Harold had left behind a confidential supplement to his will. Something deliberately kept from my father until the right moment. Then he slid a set of documents across the desk and told me my grandfather had left me the lake house in Lake Geneva. I was stunned. That house had been the setting of the only summers in my childhood when I felt like I could breathe. It was where I read books beside the window, sat on the dock with Grandpa, and experienced peace without having to compete for anyone's attention. I had always assumed that house would go to my father. But it didn't. It went to me. Free and clear. Worth around $800. Ling ling ling. Maintained through a separate trust my grandfather had set up before he died. Mr. Marsh also handed me a letter written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting. In it, he said that if I was reading this, things had probably fallen apart the way he always feared they would. He apologized for not being able to do more while he was alive. But he told me he had always seen me. Always known I was the one who saw things clearly. I cried in that office harder than I had cried in years. After everything I had endured, being called jealous, negative, difficult, there had always been one person who understood that I was simply telling the truth. But the comfort didn't last long. 2 weeks later, my mother called and demanded that I sell the house to help pay Meredith's legal fees and my father's mounting problems. She said it was family property. I told her I was family too, even if they had never treated me like it. When she called me selfish, I laughed. They had gambled everything on the wrong daughter. And now they wanted the daughter they had dismissed to rescue them with the only thing, the one person who truly loved me, had left behind. I said no. For the first time in my life, I refused to let guilt force me into one more sacrifice. In the end, the collapse happened exactly the way I had feared it would. Meredith pleaded guilty to multiple fraud charges and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. My father took a plea deal, ended up on probation, and was permanently barred from participating in investment activities. Civil lawsuits from defrauded investors cost my parents their house, their cars, and nearly everything else they had left. They moved into a small, damp 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like mildew and regret, a long way from the polished life they had tried so hard to project. I did visit them once. I brought groceries, not because they deserved it, but because they were still my parents. And I wanted to help in a way that didn't destroy me. At the same time, I started truly rebuilding my own life. I was promoted to Director of Forensic Accounting. I had my own team, my own office, and a salary that made even me blink when I looked at the number. I spent weekends at the Lake Geneva house, restoring it, repainting it, setting up a reading corner in my grandfather's honor. I started therapy and finally learned how to name what I had lived through. I learned that surviving by making myself smaller wasn't my fault, but it also couldn't be how I lived forever. I met James, a steady man who kept his word and showed up when he said he would. And that alone made me realize how starved I had been for consistency my whole life. Now, I no longer need my family's approval to believe I have value. I love them from a safe distance. I help when I can without harming myself, and I protect my peace like it is the most valuable thing I own. I did not get a fairy tale ending. No one fell to their knees and begged forgiveness. No perfect family portrait was ever restored. But I got something better. I got truth. I got boundaries. I got peace. And I got myself. If you've ever been the quiet one in your family, the one who is overlooked, dismissed, or blamed for telling the truth, I want you to remember this. You are not weak. You are not crazy. And you are not the problem. Sometimes the person who sees most clearly is the one everyone tries hardest to silence. If this story spoke to you, subscribe to the channel and stay with me for more stories about family, boundaries, and finding your worth again.